afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy and very glad to be presenting at this amazing conference. You set a very high level of lectures, of talks, so I hope you will enjoy my talk as well as I was enjoying yours. And thank you, John, for inviting me today. I'm very glad to be here. So I want to start my presentation with the point that light pollution is growing annually approximately 10% across the globe, and we have to actually do something with it. And what can be the next steps of our work? I want to also show you some pictures which I found very interesting. This summer I went to some caves in Belgium, and we all know that we're constantly changing our outdoor environment, but we're also changing the caves. So this is the amount of light we put in extremely dark environments. And I was walking there on my tour and taking pictures because we're basically creating a new ecosystems under each artificial light source in the cave. So how long we're going to continue altering our environments everywhere? So, as we all know, there are a lot of impacts on the environment and the different species, which are already well known. And what actually could be our next steps? And in my opinion, our next step should be the development of regulatory framework and the policy work. Today, I structured my talk based on the three elements. First, I'm going to be talking about the triggers which led to the development of the regulatory framework across the globe. Then I'm going to provide you with classification of regulatory instruments which I adopted worldwide. I've been working on this subject for more than 5 years, and I have, together with my colleagues, analyzed more than 70 countries on this subject. And then I will give you some examples. So what are the triggers which contributed to the development of the regulatory framework? And here I want to mention 3 main points. The first trigger to the development of regulations on the field of light pollution mitigations were energy efficiency legislation. So from October 2022, more than 600 local governments across Europe started to adopt light pollution measures, which basically led to the complete switch off of lighting in certain areas in the towns. I can give you an example of Ghent, where I'm living, and people started to complain and started to ask to return light back. So when we're talking about the complete switch off based on the energy efficiency, it's not very well received by people, right? And the second point here is we have energy efficient lighting, which we know, and a lot of people talked about it today, contributes a lot to the increase of light pollution, like here we're talking about LEDs. So we shouldn't be solely focusing on energy efficiency. So the second trigger, which led to the development of the regulatory framework, are environmental concerns. So we have a lot of research which proves this impacts of artificial light on different species, on habitats, ecosystems, and all the whole research we have. And these results, they didn't go unnoticed and were put in some policy and regulatory actions in some countries, and resulted in the changes of the environmental legislation and policy. And the third trigger, which I found also very important, is astronomy and space sustainability. The action is very limited, but it's there, which is good. And here we can find that more and more bodies or governments started to think about our future space exploration, space sustainability, and as a part of it we can find some norms related to astronomical protection, or let's say path forward to mitigating the impacts from satellites. So here I created a little map of Europe which shows the countries which, the darker purple color is the countries which adopt light pollution measures in law or policy, and then you have the lighter purple color, which is the countries which are actively working on the subject. But I want to say that I'm talking here about the initiatives more, like in the UK you don't have legislation, but you have a lot of work and a lot of initiatives, and people try to lobby the regulations to a certain level. So you see that more and more countries actually started to adopt legislation and regulatory frameworks in Europe. So my second part of my talk is going to be about the classification of regulatory framework. So you talk about climate change, or if you talk about environmental protection, we clearly know that there is a field of law, which we can look at and find all the norms we need. When we talk about light pollution or regulation of lighting, it's very difficult for us to identify what do we have in our country. So in my work, I try to classify the existing instruments into 4 main categories to help professionals, policymakers, and people who are just interested in the subject to identify where we can find certain measures. And by QR code, you can find a preprint of the paper, which is currently under review. So the first category is the division of all instruments into policy and law. I know I'm working a lot with astronomers, biologists, and they tend to call everything policy, which is a bit of a mistake from the legal point of view. So I want to point out that these 2 categories are very interconnected and interdependent. But when we talk about the legal instruments, we're talking about the imposition of obligation on countries and citizens to impose certain measures related to artificial light at night. And here we're talking about the possibility to enforce this obligation by the certain governments. So I'm talking about laws, decrees, and regulations which are adopted by country. When we talk about the policy instruments, it's more soft instruments, so it indicates the need, for example, to adopt the law, the need to reduce light pollution by a certain period of time. However, we don't have a possibility to enforce the policy through the court or for police. So when we're aiming to have only the policy, we not necessarily will have the future implementation of it. So we have to first maybe start with the political changes to impose certain goals, but then we have to proceed to have more legal instruments for the real enforceable action. So the second category is, which is close to policy and law, we have binding hard instruments, and then we have non-binding soft instruments. So when we're talking about binding hard instruments, we're talking about the, again, impose an obligation on the governments or citizens or people or companies, whatever, to reduce and implement certain measures related to light pollution. These binding instruments, which is very important, they're adopted in the specific procedures and by empowered international or national bodies. And when we talk about non-binding soft law instruments, here we talk about guidelines or recommendations. And the difference between hard and soft instruments is that the soft instruments can be also adopted by non-government organizations. Like, I work together with the International Astronomical Union, CPS, Connie Walker will be talking about later, and we have developed a certain number of guidelines, which are non-binding, but it's an important instrument for us as well. The third category, which I want to bring your attention to, is the levels of the regulations. I think somebody was talking about it today, that we have to take the action down, top, and top-down. So we have the international level. When we're talking about the light pollution, it's a transboundary international concern and requires the action by all countries together. This is where we have to aim for, right? Then we have the EU level, obviously for only EU member states. But here we're also talking about light pollution as a transboundary concern, which requires the action by the member states. So if we adopt the law or policy at that level, it will affect all the member states. And then we have national and the local level. And here we're obviously talking about that light pollution is a concern of a smaller territory of the country or municipality. So in my opinion, we have to pay attention and work through all the different levels, because in practice, if you start work from the local level, it will feed in to the national level action, and if you adopt and work on the international level, it will affect the national state as well. So we have a lot of work to do, put it that way. And the last category, which I found very important, and I spent a lot of years thinking about it, so where we actually can find light pollution regulations in which areas of legislation or policy, it's important for us to understand where the lighting measures are and what can be the most efficient, what we should aim for the most. And I will guide you through my very beautiful slide here. So the first is energy efficiency, field of regulations. And again, here we're talking about when we look at the lighting norms, only from the perspective of energy efficiency. Again, this is not the most effective, as we all know, because we're talking about the inclusion of LEDs, which leads to increase of light pollution and can have effects on the environment. So this is not the best field of regulations we should aim for. The next one is urban planning. Planning legislation and planning documents, we have it in every country. The very basic explanation is each country divided into different zones. For example, commercial, residential zones. And these zones, they define how you can use this territory specifically. And it also includes other parameters, like, for example, the amount of light you can have per zone, like urban zone or residential zone and commercial zone. And the problem with the current regulations or planning documents is we only have the minimum amount of light per zone rather than the maximum amount of light. So the actions we can take, and some countries are already doing it, they're imposing the maximum amount of light per zone in the country, which will lead to potential reduction of lighting. The next area of regulation is environmental protection. Here, pretty easy. Here, we can talk about the three main points. It's about recognition of light as a pollutant, recognition of light pollution as a form of pollution, or recognition of nocturnal environment as a integral part of our natural environment. And a lot of countries started to adopt this approach because basically when we are not protecting the nighttime, we're not protecting half of our environment. So. Then we have protection of astronomy and observations. This is very limited regulations, but they do exist in some countries. And we're talking about creating the special zones which help astronomical observations and protect the dark and quiet skies. You can find it, for example, in Russia, very limited, or United States, when they put the protection zone around the observatory. However, because light pollution beyond this zone is not regulated, this zone doesn't really help. The next is public procurement. I will be talking about European public procurement criteria later, but just to make the point, when we talk about the public procurement, we're talking about the future projects, and some countries or EU level, they started to think about, well, when they think about the future project, it's the best moment to think about the lighting as well, and they started to include lighting considerations there. So when we talk about if the future project will be connected or close to the national park, they have the measures to reduce light as much as possible. Yeah, so it's very interesting. I'm going to give you an example later. Then we have protection of indigenous communities. Other people give very interesting perception of cultural and traditional protection. Again, this legislation is very limited, but we can find norms there. The good example is United States, state of Hawaii. They have a planning document which specifically indicate light pollution measures with regard to the protection of cultural activities and traditional activities of indigenous people. Then we have cultural heritage. It's also pretty limited, but interesting, and I know that Austria started to work in that direction. So here we're talking about the recognition of our dark skies and nocturnal environment as a common heritage. But the problem here is UNESCO treaty, which is the main treaty on the protection of our cultural and natural heritage of humankind. In 2007 or 8, indicated specifically that dark skies in itself and celestial objects cannot be protected under UNESCO Convention. But there are other ways to do it when we're talking about recognition of, for example, dark sky park or dark sky area as a natural heritage. So there are ways, but it's a lot of work again. Then we have space sustainability legislation, so space law. In space law, we have the main right, the right of freedom of exploration of outer space, which is now being very violated by satellites being sending there every day. So in space sustainability concerns, dark and quiet skies start to be considered as an issue, but the process is very, very slow and we only have recommendations. And finally, but not like it's very important, some countries started to have the special field of law or regulations related to protection of dark and quiet skies or light pollution mitigation acts. The countries are pretty limited, mainly in Europe, But the point of this legislation or policy is that it's overreaching. So it's not focusing on astronomy or nature conservation or human health. It's overreaching and have different measures related to that. So I want to point out that this classification is very important, and it's related to on how we communicate with our governments. We have different governments. We have green governments. So when you have a green government and you would like to have policy or regulations, you have to point out into, for example, environmental aspects of light pollution. If you have more right government, it's important to talk about energy efficiency and how much money they're going to save. So this classification will help you to find out the best way on communicating with the government. Well, it's my opinion, maybe. But from the practice, it's really helpful. Now I will give you some examples based on the classification and what's going on across different countries. I have identified there are two main approaches on, let's say, the beginning of light pollution regulations. The first is the adoption of specific light pollution law, Light Pollution Act, and the second is the changing related to environmental legislation. So I have here three examples which illustrate basically these two approaches and one combined approach. So Croatia was the first European country which adopted Act on the Protection Against Light Pollution in 2021. It's an act which, again, overreaching act, as I said, so it relates to the mitigation of impact on the environment, human health, and basically well-being in general. It has a lot of measures, I'm not going to stop on them. I can send you the link if you like to. And then they also adopted 3 ordinances which help to expand the measures which are in the law. And these ordinances, like I would just want to highlight one point, that the whole Croatia is divided into different lighting zones, and they define the measures specifically per zone, and then they also indicated the maximum parameters per each zone as well. The bad side of that law, again my personal subjective opinion, is that the legislation in Croatia, they don't have sanctions for non-compliance with the legislation. So what we actually do if the person or the company doesn't change lighting. This is not the best part of it. Then we have Germany. In 2022, Germany adopted Insect Protection Act, which amended the Federal Nature Conservation Act. The main focus of the legislation is the protection of insects from the impacts of artificial light at night. They also have a number of norms, which are basically all around the responsible outdoor lighting, which was mentioned by many people, Ruskin and the others. And then we have France, which created the combined approach. So France adopted the environmental legislation, and they also have a number of regulations related to light pollution specifically. And what is very recent and very interesting, they have National Biodiversity Strategy 2013 in France, which included very recently an ambition target to halve the light pollution by 2030. My question is, the main problem we have, we don't have measurements of light pollution, like how much light pollution is there in France now. So how we're gonna calculate that they halve the light pollution by 2030? And this is where coming back to the policy instruments. So we can say a lot of stuff in the policy, but how we actually implement it, this is the main issue. So this is very briefly the national examples. Then we have the EU action. At the European Union, currently there is no specific legislation or policy related to light pollution, but light pollution has mentioned in several policy and legal documents. It's mentioned in the Policy Act 8 Environmental Action Program, which indicates that light pollution is a part of the Zero Pollution Plan, and we have to aim to its reduction. Nothing else is mentioned, so we may know that nothing is going to happen. Then we have ESA, Zero Debris Charter, which was adopted in 2023. It's rather, again, guidelines, which were adopted by the European Space Agency, and they indicate that we need to consider the impacts on dark and quiet skies when we are indicating the space activities. Then we have future policy brief from the European Commission, which was also pretty recently adopted, which talking about the impacts of light pollution in different dimensions and the measures which could be potentially implemented by the countries. But again, It doesn't have that much power or changes with regard to the national actions. But it's important to have it. Then we have a lot of projects over the years in Europe, and one of the latest projects, which started January 2024, so this year, it's Plan B and Aquaplan. And the scientific coordinator of Plan B project. Our main work is circulated around the better understanding on the impacts on light and noise pollution on terrestrial biodiversity and proposal of the policy action to the European Commission. So I put a lot of effort to this project because we will have to deliver 3 policy briefs. So hopefully, because the European Commission will have to read the policy brief, please contact me what you want to include in that. And then finally, which is a very recent law, European Commission and European Union adopted the Nature Restoration Law, which in its preamble, basically not even in the article, includes that countries, the member states, when developing the nature restoration plans, have to consider the impact of artificial light at night. But have to, like, what is the, should be able to consider. Like, what does it really mean? So the chances that they will not include that in the restoration plans are pretty high, except the countries who already have the light pollution legislation. Again, another big part of the policy work of the European Union are presences of the European Council. Very briefly for people who are not in the EU. European Council is the European body which is responsible of basically communicating and policy making and talks to the European Commission and the Parliament on which action we have to take next with regard to the regulatory development. And then the presidency is held by different member states and it shifts every half a year. So what we're doing with our colleagues is trying to push the subject of light pollution in the different presidencies, at least to have an event to raise awareness, right? Because again, we here all know about light pollution, but when you talk about the people outside this room, it's pretty difficult and you always have to explain it over and over again. So we try to have this event to raise awareness and also to bring some kind of small political action, like policy week, for example. So it starts from the Czech Republic, or Czechia nowadays. They had the International Light Pollution Workshop in 2022, which many of you have attended. And the result was the appeal, which to reduce light pollution in Europe. So basically it was a policy document which was communicated to the European Commission. And it consists of a very brief explanation why light pollution is an issue and why the EU has to take action with a little bit of proposed action. This appeal was discussed between ministries of the environment of the different member states and it was received, it started to receive attention. Okay. Then we have Spanish presidency. There was also a meeting which ended up in Light Pollution Manifesto. We're still pushing the manifesto forward for the political action, and then there was the Light Pollution Conference, so we are trying to push it forward and forward. We're going to have 2 minutes, I have to speed up with this. Then we have the EU Green Public Procurement Criteria. It's not yet adopted, there was some suggestions how it should be changed. And basically we have to consider whether something should be lit or not. So we put darkness in the first place rather than light in the first place. So it's all about that. It's not yet adopted. And then we have the international action, which is also very important, because I don't have much time. I have 2 examples. So we have the United Nations Environmental Program, and we have the work going on in the space sector, so related to UNOSA. So from United Nations Environmental Program, I want to give you an example of Convention on Migratory Species, which was signed in 1979, and it's all about the protection of migratory species. So very briefly on the action, they started working on light pollution very extensively. In 2020, they adopted the resolution and the guidelines, which were developed basically by the Australian government, but they endorsed it and adopted it for all member states of the CMS. And then they took it from there, and till this day, they continue working on developing the more guidelines on expanding on the different species. So CMS is the convention we have to work with if we want to have any changes in the United Nations Environmental Program. And also, this soon. There's going to be a meeting of conventional biological diversity, and my colleagues from Brazil, they had a chance to present the issues of light pollution there, which is also really nice. And then the next COP will be in 2026, so this is the COP. We have to aim to have an event on light pollution again. And then, very briefly on COPs, basically there was a lot of work being done with an International Astronomical Union, which has resulted in bringing the subject of dark and white skies into the agenda of COPs, which is very important because it will allow us to talk about the needs of protection of astronomy at the high UN level. Yeah. So, if we're talking about UNEP, we're talking about the protection from light pollution. Let's say, we're talking about the reduction of environmental impacts, and when we talk about COPs, we're talking about the protection of the space aspect or astronomy. So my final slide, a little bit over time. The current regulatory framework, very broadly, it's very diverse, complex, and very unsystematic. So it will require a lot of work to figure out the legislation within one country. It mainly focuses, unfortunately, in most of the countries, on energy efficiency. We have a big problem with implementation, mainly with regards, we don't have defined competence, and we also, most of the cases, we don't have sanctions for non-compliance with the regulations. And what can be the solution? I think we have to work towards more binding regulations at a different level. We have to have cooperation and joint action between different stakeholders, but also between different levels of the government. We have to have multi-actor involvement, so thank you, John, and other organizers to have this amazing conference, which bring people with different backgrounds, which allow us to think how it can be changed. We have to legally recognize light pollution as an environmental pollution, environmental concern, which will allow us to use the existing environmental measures, for example, environmental impact assessment or environmental monitoring, already for light pollution without significant changes. And this is what governments really like. They don't like to change legislation. So pushing through environmental path is very good. Then we have to address all the impacts. We have to talk about sanctions for non-compliance, awareness raising campaigns, biomonitoring, and the application of responsible outdoor lighting principle. My final message is stop spreading the light and start caring about the night. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the very comprehensive talk. There's time for one or two quick questions. Any questions?
Hi. Did you look at the Chilean law that was passed?
Yes.
You want to tell us something about it?
I mean, originally the Chilean, it was a standard which was related to the protection of observation, so it's very astronomy focused. And then they expanded it to the territory. Very recently they expanded it to the territory of the whole country. And again, it has the problem of the competence. So who is going to be responsible for looking when lighting is located and stuff like that? So they didn't define that aspect. And it also doesn't talk about, specifically about the environmental impacts, and also no sanctions. So there would be a problem of implementation, in my opinion again.
Yeah, so it just seems like from your presentation, like in some of those countries like Germany, France, and like you said, Croatia is obviously adopting this national legislations, right?
Yes.
So I guess how much do they use the standards in that part of the world? You know, lighting design practices. Because I noticed in one of your slides you mentioned, I think a technical parameter like upward light.
Yeah.
So that's like some like a technical parameter that's in the standard. So the question is, do you also use lighting design standards, for example, in that part of the world as well? I'm sure you do, right? Because here in New Zealand, as I was discussing earlier, obviously we use standards in this part of the world, and where the national legislation has actually been sort of, it's been a bit hard to get to that level so far. So just wanted to find, what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, just very briefly on standards. Standards are always non-binding till the moment the national law will specifically address the standards. So, in most of the cases like Croatia, they have the standards separately, which they adopted for the ordinance for the specific lighting parameters. So they do have lighting standards. While in some countries, they still are developing it. What Austria did, they had already light pollution ordinance. And last year, or this summer, but very recently, they just cited this national standard in environmental legislation, thereby making it binding. Before you have the direct link to it, it's not binding, so the company can follow some standards with the good practices, but there is no, like, they don't have to do that. So we really have to aim to the direct link from the law to the good standards. This would be a very brief answer. Okay.
Let's thank our speaker again.